Greetings and salutations, Greek students. We continue our study of Biblical Greek by turning to Lesson 27 of Clayton Croy's Primer of Biblical Greek, where we're going to learn about a different type of pronoun. Now, we've seen third-person pronouns, we've seen personal pronouns, these he, she, its, these they, these thems, different pronouns that we find in Greek. And the rules of the pronouns that we're going to talk about in Lesson 27 are mostly the same as what we see with these other forms of pronouns, but it's a different type. We're going to begin with interrogative pronouns. So let's get right into it. Interrogative pronoun is who or what. So whenever you see one of these interrogative pronouns, you're going to expect to have what? A question. It's setting up a question. These interrogative pronouns are fairly easy to recognize. Tis and ti, tenos, tini, tena, tenes, tenon, tisi. Tenos in the masculine and feminine, so it's the same who in masculine or feminine, and the neuter forms, as you can see, are quite similar, except for in the nominative and accusative, which, as we would expect in neuter, are different, but not different, or are different from the masculine and feminine, but not different from each other. So, of course, ti, tina, and tina are different than their masculine and feminine counterparts, but they're the same, the neuter and the accusative in the singular and plural. So you can see that difference. That's really the only difference you're going to notice in these relative pronouns, or these interrogative pronouns, who and what. They're going to be using questions or indirect questions, so you'll expect to see question marks when you see interrogative pronouns. Now, what's a little bit confusing about interrogative pronouns is the form of the indefinite pronouns, someone, something, or some, is exactly the same. The only difference is in the accentuation of these pronouns. So tis and ti, you'll notice, are exactly the same, except they don't have the accent marks. So it's sometimes hard to differentiate these two. You can just sort of try in the translation of the sentence, does it make sense to read this as who or what? Or does it make sense to read this as, instead of who or what, someone, something, right? Because these are not talking about who or what. They're talking about, these are indefinite, someone, something. It's someone is doing the speaking, but it's not definite. We don't know who that someone or what that something is. So those are indefinite pronouns. We also have relative pronouns, translated as who, which, or what. Relative pronouns you're going to see quite a bit, functioning like what we think of as theys or thems, personal pronouns, except they just are going to be who rather than he or she or it or them. Although sometimes in the New Testament you'll even see these relative pronouns translated as he or she. A good example, you see these quite a bit, like in Philippians 2 when it talks about Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. So you do see these in the New Testament, and sometimes you'll even see them translated as he or she, but they are relative pronouns, who or what. As we would expect with pronouns, which function a lot like adjectives, they have to have three genders. We have the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter forms of these relative pronouns. You'll also notice if you look at these, these relative pronoun forms look very familiar. They look, like the definite article. So if you're familiar with the definite article, you're not learning a new form really. You're just thinking about, okay, when I recognize these, the thing you want to notice about these relative pronouns is the rough breathing mark. Has, he, ha, who, heis, who. So these relative pronouns, and you'll notice, for example, heis here, or hain, is the same letters for the imperfect form of a me, was, but instead of it being ain, it's hain. So there are some instances where really paying attention to these breathing marks, in this case the rough breathing mark, is going to help you identify, rough breathing mark, I'm looking at a relative pronoun. So just be aware as you're looking at these relative pronouns, the interrogative pronouns, the accents, you have to pay attention to what's going on with them. Now, we haven't talked a lot about accentuation rules, and mostly it's because I think it will end up confusing you more at this point than helping you, but they are important. Now, it's also important to recognize that accents are a later scholarly convention, and so the New Testament, when it's actually written, is not written with accent marks. And so when we make accent mark choices as editors, we're reflecting something that is developed later on. That doesn't mean they're not helpful, they're not valid. It just means that we have to remember we can recognize what kind of word we're looking at, whether it's the imperfect form of a me, was, or the relative pronoun who, referring to a woman, or a feminine noun, based on the context. That should become clear based on what's going on. So a couple of things going on. And again, if we're thinking about seeing these things in arguments or narratives, it's going to be easier to tell than just in the abstract. Like personal pronouns, relative pronouns agree with their antecedent, that is the noun they're replacing, in gender and number, but not case. And the reason for the change in case is that the case is determined by the function of the pronoun in its clause. So a couple of examples here. The first example, the man who saw the Lord is an apostle. So in this instance, who is the subject of the verb eide, saw. So ha anthropos, the man, our subject. Who saw, which one are we talking about? The relative pronoun, it's the man who saw. Hos is the subject of the verb eide, saw. So it's who. And the case of the ha, or the hos in this instance, has to mirror, is defined by its function in the clause. So it's the subject, so the man who saw the Lord is an apostle. Now in the second example, you have mostly a very similar sentence, but in this instance, the relative pronoun is thrown into the accusative case. Ha anthropos han edamen estin apostolos. The man whom we saw is an apostle, because we are doing the seeing, and what did we see? We saw whom, that is the man who is an apostle. And so in this instance, the relative pronoun is identifying for us the direct object of the verb. And so because it's the direct object of the verb, even though it agrees with ha anthropos in gender, masculine, and in number, singular, its case is defined by its function in the clause in which it appears. And so this is normal. This is exactly what we'd expect in third-person pronouns with autos, for example. So it's the same rules that are applying here with these indefinite pronouns. It's just recognizing how they work. And this is one of those grammar things that will actually probably help you a little bit with English grammar to recognize, okay, am I looking at the function of a relative pronoun in the direct object, in the indirect object? As a subject, is it who or whom or that or which? All of that will become more clear as you're doing this translating, as you're sort of forced to think about, okay, what's the correct English rule for translation here? So that's relative pronouns. We also have indefinite relative pronouns, which is just combining indefinite pronouns and relative pronouns, smashing them together. So hatis, hatis, hati, hatines, hatenes, hatena. The combination of relative pronouns and the indefinite pronoun are only in the nominative forms. So you're only going to see them in nominative, masculine, feminine, neuter, singular, and plural. And that covers nearly all the indefinite relative pronouns that we see in the New Testament. So you just need to pay attention to these nominative, indefinite, singular, and plural relative pronouns. And these are more of sort of be aware of than have like deeply ingrained in your psyche for translating New Testament Greek. Know that these are out there and you can sort of see, oh, hos, relative pronoun, tis, indefinite pronoun, oh, indefinite relative pronoun smashed together. So this is two separate concepts that are just being smashed into one in these instances. In lesson 27, Croy also gives you the full conjugation of the verb oida, which is actually the perfect tense form of eido, I see, but because it's in the present state of having been seen, it usually gets translated as know. So in the present tense, I know, oida, you know, oidas, he, she, it knows, oiden, oidamen, we know, oidate, y'all know, oidasi, they know. And he also I give here the imperfect forms, and he gives the full conjugation in Croy, so you can look at that if you want to see it, but these are the forms that you see. You do see oida quite a bit, especially in the in visionary material and other things where you're learning information, oida. So that's the content of what we see in lesson 27. We see the verb oida, and we see these indefinite relative pronouns. We see relative pronouns. We see indefinite pronouns, and of course, interrogative pronouns. It sounds like kind of confusing, but as we'll see in some example sentences, it's not really that difficult. It's just learning to recognize these shorter particle words for what they are and going, oh, okay, that's how it's functioning in the sentence, and then going from there. So that's lesson 27 from N. Clayton Croy's Primer of Biblical Greek.